Brucham Aboyim to the fifth in the continuing series of shiurim on the sixth. The sixth, and continuing. So we're even more continuing series of shiurim on the Ikkarim the Rambam. So last time we spoke about the Yesod HaRavi, the fourth principle, which is, the Rambam calls it Kadmos, but really the principle is about Briyish behind ex-nihilo, certainly according to the text of Rabbi Shilat, which is a Gils of the Rambam, the text of the Rambam, which Rabbi Kapach was uncovered, and we spoke about the centrality of the principle of Briyish Me'ayin, and we spoke about the fact that the Rambam says in the Gimel Ikarim, in the Perishim, Hakdama to Perishim, Mishnayos Sanhedrin, Ki Yasoid HaYosef Gadol Teres Moshe Rabbeinu. So, once you say that, it doesn't leave any room for doubt what the Rambam held about Briyish Me'ayin. But the fact is that the concept of Briyish Me'ayin, on one hand, probably represents the most central debate that the Rambam carries on with Aristotle in the Moreh Nevuchim. The creation actually extends from chapters 13 to 30 in the Moreh Nevuchim. That's technically, actually extends from 12 to 30. But the fact is that with the Rambam's position on the creation of the world, whether it's eternal or whether it was created ex nihilo, is probably the most controversial of the Rambam's positions, both in the Ikarim and in the Moreh Nevuchim. Meaning is that the discussion of really what the Rambam really is espousing has probably taken more ink than any scholarly topic or any topic in the history of Jewish thought. For those of you who are interested in a brief survey of it, of course I can recommend Professor Shapiro's book on creation ex nihilo, and there he goes through, I would say, the scholarly read. I'm not sure that's called a tata de sase, contradiction in form, but Professor Shapiro, I think, gives a very good overview of the what people have held about the Rambam's position. Many people, including the traditional Mefarshim, or the Rishonim, have held that, in fact, the Rambam's secret position is that he believed in the eternity of the world. And there is, in fact, actually good reason for believing this. Not only does the Rambam, as we mentioned before, and several times, that the Rambam actually assumes the eternity of the world as proof of God's existence and incorporeality. And the Rambam, as we mentioned, actually, in this principle, says that, mentions the fact that he assumes eternity to prove God's existence. But, of course, there are many statements within the Moreh Nevuchim which suggest that, in fact, actually he could have actually held secretly. If you believe in the esoteric and exoteric theories and positions espoused by many people, which the Rambam himself speaks about in his introduction. So there are countless clues, or people look for constant hints within the guide for the perplexed as to his position.
So, without getting too technical, is that Platonic or Aristotelian eternity?
So once again, there are actually Mefarshim, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Moshe Navoni, who held explicitly that Rambam's position was actually Aristotelian. But for example, some have claimed that his position was actually Platonic. In fact, the Rambam says explicitly in chapter 25 of section 2 of the guide that one could believe in Platonic and the Platonic view of eternity, and that's acceptable.
What's the difference between them?
We'll speak about this in a little while. The Aristotelian view of eternity in the world basically means that the world as it is was always as it is. In other words, the world has never changed. According to Plato, there was some amorphous matter or formless matter called the Iyuli, which people know from the Rambam's Perush on the Torah in the first pasuk, and from that HaKadosh Baruch Hu fashioned the world. But according to Plato, there was always a pre-existent Iyuli, and according to Aristotle, the world just always was. It's interesting is that there's a Professor Davidson from somewhere in California who wrote an interesting article in which he actually or to declare that one of the places where actually the Rambam seems to hint that his real position was that the world is in fact eternal botanic form, is actually the beginning of chapter 32 of the second section, where Maimonides begins the section on Nevuah, on prophecy. So the Rambam says that there are three positions of the concepts of Nevuah, of prophecy. One is that any person can become a prophet. Kodesh Baruch Hu just makes him into a prophet. The second position is that prophecy is purely natural. God doesn't. There's no need of any divine interference. And the third opinion is that prophecy requires a certain amount of natural ability and some training. But of course, the Kodesh Baruch Hu, through divine providence, will either cause a prophet to prophesize or not to prophesize. And the Rambam says that these three opinions of prophecy correspond to the three opinions of the creation of the world. So if we just look at it, it's very interesting. That anyone can be a prophet is probably creation ex-nihilo. That God does not interfere in prophecy, it's purely a natural product, that's the turning of the world. The third opinion, that a person has to have some type of a natural ability in training, but that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, actually makes him to a prophet, that's the third opinion. That appears to apply to the, corresponds to the Platonic theory of eternity. So that's a very interesting allusion in the Rambam, that his actual opinion was that the true principle of the Torah was that of Platonic eternity. That's I personally think Joel Davidson, who actually wrote a book about the Rambam, actually brings this an interesting proof. Now, I'm not going to go into the entire discussion, really, what the Rambam really secretly held, because I don't think that actually there's a I'm going to disagree with this, the contending opinion that he said one thing but really held something else, and I'm going to explain to you why this evening. But actually, we've spoken about this before in the different lectures on creation. But the Rambam at the very beginning of the Morning of Uchem speaks about that there are going to be contradictions. Okay, and he speaks about two types of contradictions. One type of contradiction he speaks about is that sometimes a topic is very difficult, so therefore, when it's first introduced, it has to be taught on a very simple level, and then afterwards one can teach it on a much more advanced level. Then that's, of course, a way in which you teach topics. You don't introduce them with their full complexity. But the Rambam says another different type of contradiction, which he's going to use in the guide, and that is sometimes understanding a topic requires different assumptions at different times. And the Rambam says, so therefore, sometimes to approach a certain topic, there might be contradictory assumptions, and because of that, the Rambam says this is another type of contradiction that's going to, in fact, actually occur in the guide. Now, my position is that the concept of creation actually, that the notion of eternity and the creation ex nihilo are of this form. In other words, basically, my position is that the Rambam held that both are true, right? And I'm going to explain to you in a little while why I think that's true. First of all, the Rambam, of course, in chapter 13, in section 2, introduces, right, the three theories of creation. There is, of course, the opinion of Teras Moshe, which is that the world was created ex nihilo, yesh b'ayin, from absolute nothing. And then there's the opinion of Aristotle, that the world is eternal in the strong sense, namely that the world the way it is, always was, right? In which case, right? And the third opinion is that the world originally, matter was eternal in a formless shape, that's called the hiuli, and from that eternal matter, the Kodesh Baruch Hu fashioned and created the world. Those are the three opinions. Now, it's interesting that the Rambam, now I'm in the Schwartz edition, which is in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew, and page 298, the Rambam now asserts that creation ex nihilo implies that everything was created, yesh b'ayin, including time. In other words, since time is a property in the physical world, that's a property of motion, according to Aristotelian science. So therefore, right, time, like everything else, right, has to have been created. And the Rambam says, I'm reading from 298, the third paragraph, Hanachid l'shitosenu, she'azamanu dava nivra, time is something creative, and noitzek kachol ha'mikim v'atzon v'hanoisim mikim eil. Like every, in other words, every physical event, or every property, every object and property. Therefore, you can't say that God created the world at any time. You can't say that, because time is creation. According to Rambam, we spoke about this. You can't say the world was created 5,671 years ago. By definition, you can't say the world was created at any time. Because to say the world was created at a certain time in the past means that 1 second before that there was a time the world didn't exist. You can't speak about time before the creation of the world. Right? Says the Rambam, I want you to reflect upon this very, very much. So therefore, you won't want it to counter arguments. People will prove to you that of course the world wasn't created ex-nihilo. Right? Because once you say that there was time before the world was created, in other words, if you say the world, right, is a certain number of years old, then ipso facto, right, that number of years plus epsilon, plus a little time the world didn't exist, and therefore there's a time before the world. Now, what is the Rambam saying, right? You have to think about this, it's very, very difficult, right? The fact is that for the fact that you can't say that the world was created at any time, according to the Rambam, raises the question is creation, what type of theory of creation is creation ex-nihilo? Is that a theory of creation? Because you can't say the world was created at any time. In other words, what can you say about creation ex-nihilo? What type of theory of creation is it? The act of creation, it's interesting, the act of creation, it's an act. It's a definitive act, which of course would have to assign a time for that act of creation. If in fact creation ex-nihilo cannot be an act of creation at any time, so what type of an act is it? How can you describe it? Moreover, what's very, very interesting is that in Chelik Gimel, the third section of the Moreh Nevuchim, in Perek Chafei, the Rambam there begins the chapters which have to do with called Tabei HaMitzvahs, the reasons for the mitzvahs. So the Rambam's assertion is that when a Kadosh Baruch Hu creates something, it does something, he does it with reason. In other words, God acts based upon rational grounds, for a reason. Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't do something without a reason. Now, if you say Kadosh Baruch Hu does something for a reason, acts on rational grounds, so the reason has to exist before he acts. Which means if Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world with a certain reason, the Rambam claims that there's no reason for the creation of the world. But for example, if Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world with a teva, a certain nature, right, and there's a reason and a rationale and order to the nature of the world, right? Then and the world follows certain scientific rules. So it must be that these scientific rules govern the act of creation, in which case, actually, we're faced with a type of katnus, eternity. Because there's a preconceived reason, a preconceived rationality to creation, and therefore, God, when he creates, is acting out of this created rationality, which means that what? If we speak about God acting as a rational being, which is the very basis of the Tamei HaMitzvahs, reason for the mitzvahs in the third section of the Rambam, then we're forced to sustain a certain katnus, a certain eternity. Now, the Rambam understands this is a problem, because after all, we don't believe the world's eternal. So if you actually look in section 3, chapter 25, in the Schwartz edition, page 510, so the Rambam says, look, if you believe that a Kadosh Baruch Hu, created the world, desired to create the world, right? Therefore what? Things that God wanted to do had to have been done, right? In other words, it could have, if God wanted to create the world in a certain way, then of course there cannot be any impasse to the world being created in that way. Of course, God only wants to create things that are possible. On the other hand, something is only possible if it falls into God's wisdom. In other words, something which is dictated by God's wisdom is called possible. Something which is illogical is not possible. But Kosh Baruch Hu wants to create a world which is good, so therefore it's impossible to create a world which is evil, because he wants good. Now this is the opinion of every Ben Torah believes that God wants to create a world which is good, which is rational, which is possible, etc., etc. And this is all the opinion of the philosophers. Because even though we believe that the world is ex-nihilo, which means it can't be a compelling reason, either on rational grounds or ethical grounds, but everybody agrees Kodesh Baruch Hu just didn't do it out of a whim. We believe in the wisdom of God. So what does the Rambam goes on and on and on? I think this is worthy of discussion, this paragraph, probably the entire shiur. But what the Rambam saying is that if we assign to God, to Kodesh Baruch Hu's creation, ethics, wisdom, scientific wisdom, right? So we're forced to apply a certain concept of eternity. So the Rambam understands. On the other hand, though, we believe that a Kodesh Baruch Hu created the world creation ex-nihilo. So the Rambam basically is stating this paragraph, what I would call a type of irreducible dichotomy. On one hand, in the belief of creation ex-nihilo, on the other hand, in the belief of a world which is a creation, which is ethical, and which is rational and scientific and physically possible. So, in other words, there's no doubt about it that this paragraph that Rambam is asserting that both principles are absolutely necessary. Now, why are they necessary? We could just take this idea and translate it, or use an invariance principle, to in fact actually apply to the contradiction between the Rambam's assumption of eternity in this proof of creation, God's incorporeality. On the other hand, though, writes his assertion that the fundamental principle of Teras Moshe, of the Torah Moshe Rabbeinu, is none other than creation ex nihilo. The fact is that God's existence and corporeality is an axiom. It's an axiom. That requires eternity. On the other hand, though, right, a central belief in Teras Moshe is man's free will. Man's free will is only possible if God is free will. But God can only have free will if what? If the world is creation ex nihilo. So the fact is, we're forced to say, is that not only can there not be a contradiction between creation ex nihilo and the eternity of the world, but in fact, in order to maintain all of the important principles of the Jewish faith, we're forced to believe in both of them. Now, the fact is that the Rambam, in my opinion, held that creation ex nihilo is not really a theory of creation. Creation, the way God created the world, as He created the world, has to be laden either with an ethical principle or with a scientific principle. But once the act is deemed ethical and scientific, that it cannot be creation ex nihilo, because God is being forced by a priori principle. So the fact is that creation ex nihilo is not in any way a theory of creation. There was never a debate. There was never a real confrontation, a contradiction between eternity and between creation ex nihilo. The reason the Rambam, and this is the fact actually expressed by what the Rambam writes in chapter 25 in section 2, that the Platonic theory of the eternity of the world is acceptable. Why is that true? Because actually, that theory actually contains both elements. On one hand, it allows for something which is not exclusively creation ex nihilo. But on the other hand, though, Kodesh Baruch Hu can take something which is formless and make formless, and therefore he can do miracles, he can change the world and interact in the world which we believe. On the other hand, though, the eternity of the world, even if it's a formless matter, asserts a certain infinity to creation, which allows us to prove the incorporeality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is, of course, the first and second principle. So, in other words, my point is that the Rambam was of the opinion is that while these two things might appear to be a contradiction, they're not really a contradiction. Okay, now, the fact is, in my opinion, is that, like I've said before, the Rambam was the opinion that actually you need both of them. And I think that my probably strongest proof of this, besides what I mentioned in chapter 25 of section 3, is what the Rambam says at the very end of chapter 30 in section 2. There, the Rambam, in a very, very famous chapter, actually runs through all of Ma'aseh Bereishis, right? All of Ma'aseh Bereishis, and he presents what's called I don't call it the simple, but what would be to be the apparent textual meaning of Ma'aseh Bereishis, and then what he understands to be the more philosophical understanding of Ma'aseh Bereishis. The Rambam, at the very end of chapter 30, mentions something very interesting. He says, almost when a person was already said, okay, no, we had enough already, from chapter 30 to chapter 30, at the very, very end, when people are falling asleep, it's probably only the alert reader, probably the reader the Rambam is actually earmarked, his entire God is still awake. The Rambam says that there are 4 expressions. I'm on page 370, towards the end of chapter 30 in the Schwartz edition. Okay, there are 4 creations, which in fact actually denote creation, which 4 terms of creation, which is Bora, Asa, Kana, and Kel. Okay? So there's Bora, right? Right? Bora Lokim as Shemaim v'Sa'aretz. And then there's Asa, B'yoyim Asa Hashem Eretz v'Shamayim. And then there's Koine Shemayim v'Aretz. And then there's Kel Oilam. Okay? Okay, and then the Rambam speaks, right, about these different things. Bora is clearly implied, he doesn't say it over here, but he says at the beginning of chapter 30, Bora certainly implies creation ex-nihilo. Yitzira, right, is a little different.
Yitzira was on the list.
What?
Yitzira was on the list.
Oh, I'm sorry, right, that Bora, I'm sorry, right? Okay. And then he says, he brings, right? Okay, and he speaks about Kana, right? And he says, on page 371, Kodesh Baruch becomes the master of the world, right? Only because he makes there's a kinyan, right? There's an acquisition. This implies a notion of kadmos, of eternity. Now let me ask you a question. There are 4 terms in the Chumash that refer to creation, and 1 implies kadmos. So there you have it. In the Torah itself, the Rambam is making the claim, in the Torah itself, there's actually a term, a verb that denotes creation, which actually implies kadmos. So, kadmos is given actually a biblical source, just as much as Bora. So at the very end of chapter 30, the Rambam basically, right, is asserting is that both concepts are true in the Torah. The concept of creation ex nihilo and the concept of kadmos. Yeah.
Isn't Koine used by Melchizedek? Is it used by...
Very good. Very good. Koine Shemayim v'Aretz.
So why is that? That doesn't mean it's a Jewish belief.
What?
That doesn't necessarily mean that it's an acceptable Jewish belief.
But what is the Rambam actually listed as such?
It's a phrase used denoting creation. Does that mean that?
But the Rambam actually used as such. Actually, if you look at the psukim in the Chumash, you have a Chumash here.
Yeah. Any shame ben
So what?
Well, first of all, I mean, the fact that it's used by the fact that it's actually used by Melchizedek, I mean, the Rambam first lists, he doesn't make mention of this. It's just a term to Kadmos. But the Rambam certainly would not, if the Rambam in the Chumash used this term, the fact that it's used by Melchizedek doesn't seem to mean anything. I have it anyway. But it appears after the Rambam Greeks Melchizedek. So it says Melchizedek. I'm in Lech Lecha Peritas Vav. So in Pasuk Yud Ches it says Melchizedek Melech Shalom Hoitzi Lechem V'Yoyim V'Choyim Lekel Al Yoyim. Okay. By the way, Kel. Kel Olam is used by the Rambam. Okay. So the Rambam says. Right, V'Yacher V'Yoyma Boch Avrom Lekel Al Yoyim Koinei Shamayim V'Oretz Uvor Kel Al Yoyim Hashem Yigin Tzorecha B'Yadecha V'Yitel L'Maisa Mikol. Okay. Now, what does Avram Avinu say? V'yama Avram Melech Sodom Hari Moisi Yodel Hashem Kel Al Yoyim Koinei Shamayim V'Oretz. Avram Avinu answers back Koinei Shamayim V'Oretz. So it's interesting. Avram Avinu says, "You're right. You're right. Kodesh Baruch Hu is Koinei Shamayim V'Oretz." You're right, Aristotle, Melchizedek, right? He's Kel Al Yoyim too, but he's also Yud Kei Vav Kei. He's also Yud Kei Vav Kei. And Yud Kei Vav Kei, right, would probably imply, right, belief in creation ex-nihilo. But in any case, the Rambam, now that you mentioned it, it's worth it, is that the Rambam says, where is creation ex-nihilo in Teras Moshe? So the Rambam says in chapter 13, this is page 298, right? V'lachein kara b'shem Hashem kel olam. Now, what's interesting is, after that he says, Hu evia dea zeis b'forosh ba'oimroi koinei shamayim va'aretz. By the way, Set Tezvav is really Yudalit. You know, it's interesting. In chapter 13, he says the Avram Avinu expresses creation ex-nihilo by saying, right? I'm sorry. Avram Avinu says, what are the two sources for creation ex-nihilo? I mean, according to Parak Yud Gimel. So he says, Avram says, by Kara b'shem kel al yoyim. And then he says, "B'forish koinei shamayim v'aretz," in chapter 13. So it would appear that koinei shamayim v'aretz implies to be what? Creation ex-nihilo. But in chapter 30, the Rambam says that koinei is more into lakadbus. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. Now, it could be. I mean, I'm not sure exactly. I'll tell you the truth. I'm really not sure exactly how to read this Rambam. This appears to be a very, very fundamental contradiction. I think we raised this already when we learned this. I'm not sure really how to learn the Rambam. There's a clearly contradiction. It could be. I'm going to read this. I'm going to be medayik in the Hebrew. I'm not sure how it goes in the Aramaic. The Rambam says, "V'lachein kara b'shem Hashem kel al yoyim, hu b'yad dea zeis b'mefurash." In other words, he expressed this explicitly, but when he said koinei shamayim va'aretz. Now, what does he mean when he said koinei shamayim va'aretz? What did Avram Avinu say? He said Hashem kel elyon koinei shamayim va'aretz. So what does it mean? He expressed this opinion when he said koinei shamayim va'aretz. Can we not learn the Moed Avuchim as meaning that when Avram Avinu said Hashem kel el, when he said koinei shamayim va'aretz, which is Kadmos, he also said Hashem kel elyon. In other words, don't think Avram Avinu only believed that the world was eternal. Because when he said Kodesh Shemai V'aretz, he also said Hashem kel elyon. Look, what can I do? But I think maybe that's what the Rambam meant. Okay, now, so having taken care of that, right?
The answer is, Rabbi Triebitz is saying that that eternity and creation ex-nihilo are built into the fabric of Rambam, and that's because it's built in the fabric of Chumash. Right. Necessary contradictory beliefs. Right.
Now, the argument that's used is that really, creation ex-nihilo is like, doesn't appear in the Mishnah Torah. Doesn't appear in the Mishnah Torah. And Professor Shapiro actually speaks about this, and towards the end, he brings, there are even those who have argued that not just the God, but also Mishnah Torah teaches the eternity of the world. By the way, he quotes, it's a Herbert Davidson, right? This is a contradiction to the Maimonides' exoteric view that his method of demonstrating the existence of God in Mishnah Torah based on Torah does not represent his true views. Among those who have this position are etc., etc. Okay, fine. Now, it is true, you're right. Bria Yesh B'Ayin does not appear in the Mishnah Torah, anywhere in the Mishnah Torah. Right? He doesn't speak about it in Yesod Torah at all. And what's interesting is, too, is that in Hilchas Tshuva, where he brings all the, all the different in Parak Gimel of Hilchos Shuvah, when he brings a list of all the apikosim, right? Those who believe that Kodesh Baruch is a body, etc. He doesn't believe anyone who believes in Bria Yesh B'Yayin. It is true that the Ravid, the Ravid does say that one is not allowed to bring. The Ravid does say that one is not. In other words, he says over here, whoever Rambam says in Parak Gimel, Parak Zayin, there are 5 people that are called minim. A person says there's no God, and one doesn't have a manik. A person says he's a manik, but there are 2. Or one who says Yeshu ben Echad, but he has a guf, about Tamurat. The Ravid, of course, argues on here. He's not by himself the only one. So the Ravid says, right? Amar Vram, right? Like he who says, Elokechem Saya Godel Haya, Ela Shemata by Samanim Gedolim Tova Vayu, V'choyshev Ruach Umayim Behem Asa Basha Asa. So the Ravid seems to touch up the Rambam, to interpret the Rambam as meaning is that the Rambam is arguing against the Pleiadic theory of eternity. But the fact is that Bria Yesh B'Ayin does not appear. One can understand.
What does Rambam mean?
V'chen ha'omesh en levada rishon v'tzol hakol could possibly be that the Rambam says like this: there are 5 people called minim. Ha'omesh ein sham Eloya ve'eno elamanik. One denies God. Ha'omesh yesh manik aval hem shtayim meyos. There are 2 manhigim, people 2 people direct the world. Ha'omesh yesh sham ribon echad elo shu gufu bal temuda. Here's the body. V'chen ha'omesh en levada rishon v'tzol hakol. He is, in other words, he's not the first one and created. Now, it could possibly be. Maybe the Rambam means that maybe there were 2 creators at the very beginning.
You already said it.
What?
You already said it. Someone who believes that.
No, the Rambam says is that a person believes there's a manhig, but there's 2 or more. So maybe initially there could have been 2 creators. That's how we learn the Rambam. The words Bria Yesh B'Ayin doesn't appear in the Rambam.
Right, Tzur L'Kol means...
No, Tzur L'Kol could possibly mean... Sheinu Levada Rishon V'Tzur L'Kol. What does that mean? In other words, the Rambam is the only person... According to Paul, is the only person who created the world. But I don't know if it means that there wasn't a world before that. No. Sheinu Levada Rishon V'Tzur L'Kol. In other words, Rishon could mean that nothing... In other words, nothing came before him. I'm not sure whether the fact is the terms Bria Yesh B'Ayin do not appear in the Rambam.
Isn't the Pashup Pshat the Bria Yesh B'Ayin?
No. She'en levada rishon.
That God's not the only...
V'tzor. No. Ve'en shevada rishon v'tzor l'kol. What does tzor l'kol mean? He's not... In other words, a person believes that Kodesh Baruch is not the only creator. In other words...
Not the only first, not the only creator. No.
Right, not only the creator, but doesn't mean that there could have been matter that was contemporary with God. Look, he doesn't say Bria Yesh B'Ayin. The Ravid, it is true, the Ravid seems to be saying, he was at Tzayah Gadol Haya, but he found, Toiv Avoyu, V'choyshev Ruach Umayim. It's not clear that the Rambam, I'm not sure that the Rambam means this. Just like Kadmos. What does Kadmos mean? If it didn't have the extra Hagah of that was found by Rabbi Papa, what would Kadmos mean? It doesn't mean he's prior to anything else. That can't be. That's the Rambam has to answer that. But Kadmos would mean that, in other words, it doesn't mean temporal Kadmos, but it means ontological Kadmos. In other words, he's the first. In other words, God is the first mover. But it doesn't mean that there isn't something always there that is moving. I would say means, in other words, he's the only creator. There wasn't like initially another creator besides HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what I would say. Another mover. That's what I would say. Another mover. But it doesn't mean that nothing existed. I don't think he means this. Look, in any case, he doesn't say anywhere B'riyah Yesh B'Ayin. He doesn't mention it in Yesod HaTorah. In the very beginning, he doesn't mention the Tshuva. Now, so you could argue, and by the way, it's not only these people. I think even Professor Tursky's book of Lames also mentions the fact that. So the question is, you could say, well, the Rambam believes the world's eternal, but I say no. Why no? Because in Parak Hey, in Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam speaks about free will, and he calls this in Parak Hey, Halacha Gimel, the Ikka ze Ikka Gadol Hu V'Omer HaTorah VaMitzvos. Now, what else was called Ikka Gadol? B'riyah Yesh B'Ayin. So it turns out, why does the Rambam need? What do we need creation ex nihilo? We don't need creation ex nihilo because we have to know how the world was created. We need creation ex nihilo to guarantee what? Man's free will. That's what we needed. So the Rambam decided to take the two principles and put them in several parts of the Mishnah Torah. The concept that God is incorporeal, is incorporeality, he placed it in Hilchos Tshuva. He says, this is the core I placed in Hilchos Tshuva. Creation ex nihilo, halacha l'maisa, which means free will, right, is an halacha gimel, a parakeh of the Magen Avucha. So I disagree with these respected scholars and commentators. In fact, creation ex nihilo is in the Mishnah Torah, but in other words, you have to understand what creation ex nihilo is. And the Rambam put it in a different place. I think he put it in a different place. Why did he put it in a different place? Why did he put it in the same place? Because there was a steer. There is a contradiction. So how do you deal with a contradiction? You make it two dinim. How do you make it two dinim? You put it in two parts of the Mishnah Torah. Kadmos, or eternity, which implies incorporeality, which is what the Rambam is aiming at in Hilchos Tshuva. Then he put in Parak Gimel Hilchos Tshuva. Free will, halacha l'maisa, right? That's where. That's in Hilchos Tshuva, because that speaks about the possibility of doing tshuva. A person has the free will, he goes to do tshuva. So in other words, it's clear to me that the fact that the Rambam is mentioned B'riyah Yesh B'Ayin in the Mishnah Torah is not important. Halacha l'maisa, it turns up, it pops up in Hilchos Tshuva. So and that's what the Rambam needed. Halacha l'maisa. So,
both in Hilchos.
No. Oh, they're both in Hilchos Tshuva, right. But one's in Parak Gimel, one's in Parak Hey. I'm sorry. One's in Parak Gimel, one's in Parak Hey. Okay? In Yesod HaTorah, where he speaks about God's incorporeality and God's existence, he doesn't speak about B'riyah Yesh B'Ayin. Okay? But if you look clearly in Parak Gimel list, he doesn't mention a person who believes in B'riyah Yesh B'Ayin. Once again, there are, it could possibly be now that, and let me tell you something. We can't say, like the Triebitz says, that the Rambam, when he says in Halacha, in Parak Gimel Halacha Zayin, that he's an apikoros and he doesn't know the min. You can't say that. Why can't you say that? Because then he'd be contradicting himself in where? In the Moreh Nevuchim. In other words, if the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah held that a person who believes in Plato's theory of eternity is an apikoros, is a min. It's worse, it's a min, right? But he's contradicting what he says in the Mishnah Torah 25:2, where he says explicitly that what? That you're allowed to believe in it. It's fine. So you're facing a big contradiction. I'm not sure that I don't know if the rabbis are the Moreh Nevuchim, but in any case, so it can't be. So in other words, obviously it cannot be referring to Plato's theory of eternity. He's saying something that there can't be two movers, two initial movers. That's what he's saying. Okay, fine. Now, what do we get from this is also an important thing too. This is what I want to really conclude with this.
Is the Rav going to explain how the Rambam can sustain these two systems for how the world came to be?
Because I think it's like this. There's two properties of God. On one hand, God creates the world, which is rational, which is logical, which is ethical, which is intelligible, which is scientific. Man has to be able to ascertain the rational nature of reality, which for the Rambam was important, and also the ethical concept of reality, which we spoke about, man imitating God. And of course, God is incorporeal. But in other words, God is the rational creator of the world, because the world has rational laws, right? So that requires eternity. If the world has ethical conduct, it also requires eternity. For God to have chachma, to create the world with chachma and with ratzon, with will, and with wisdom, then that requires eternity. Like the Rambam says in chapter 25 in section 3. On the other hand, God has to have free will too. God has to have free will. So in other words, if God has free will, and if God allows man to have free will, and God can act based upon God's will, that's hashgacha. Man acts according to free will, and God acts accordingly. So therefore, I have to believe in creation ex-nihilo. The two properties of God. To say a person is rational, but has free will, right? Is that a contradiction? In any person, a person can think before he acts, but can also have free will. So does anyone think that a person exists? No one thinks that is a contradiction in a person.
But
yeah.
If the idea that the world was created, the Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world with reason and
ethics,
reason and ethics. Why does that imply eternity?
Because that means that there's an ethical principle or a rational principle which is governing his creation. He's creating the world based upon a principle. The principle exists before the act of creation. That's what Rambam says.
Okay, but does creation ex nihilo somehow imply that Kadosh Baruch Hu didn't exist before?
No, chas v'shalom. But creation ex nihilo just means...
And there's no concept, and there's no time before the creation, so
it's creation. So that's what creation ex nihilo is, a concept in free will. What is free will? What is free will? If I say I'm being governed by a logical principle, I can't have free will, because I have to have the ability to do evil. I have the ability to be irrational. In other words, when I think about it, there's ontology and ethics. Ontology and ethics, right? And is does not imply an ought. On one hand, there's reason. A person, there's ethics and reason which guides a person. On the other hand, a person doesn't have free will. We accept the fact that every person has reason and also an ethical will, but every person also has free will. So how do you resolve that in any person? So the same way you resolve it, you can resolve it in God by saying they can't be resolved, but these are two necessary properties.
If a person believes that there are unchanging laws of nature, that's kadmas olam.
Right, but on the other hand, though, there's something called chava oynish. God can punish. God can make miracles. That's free will. In other words, that we're forced to say both. We have to say there's the teva. Even if you don't believe in teva, some people don't believe in science. I think most people don't believe in science, at least most, right? But what? But we believe that God does good. There's ethics, right? According to Rambam, to say that God acts on ethical principles is also a concept of kadmos.
Because it means it could exist.
Because there's an ethical principle upon which God is creating.
Right.
So square that with free will. How could God punish me if there's an ethical principle? So, in other words, once again, there's an irreducible dichotomy, but I don't want irreducible dichotomies. There has to be something about God that I don't understand. Most people claim they understand everything about God. They understand everything about God. God's everything, this and that. Everything's not really what it is. It was created like that.
But
yeah.
For this reason, someone who believes in the Big Bang is really doing kadmas olam.
Right. But this is the, I think I've spoken about it, but we'll mention this again. The concept of Big Bang is concept of olam. Any person who associates the eternity with the Big Bang, either number one doesn't know anything about physics, number two doesn't know anything about Jewish philosophy, or three.
Is Rabbi
Meir Triebitz there? Let me finish. First of all, the Big Bang has nothing to do with creation ex nihilo, because the Big Bang is a singularity in Einstein's gravitation equation. In other words, the Big Bang assumes there's a structure of space and time. So the Big Bang is spitz katmos. As far as I'm concerned, the steady-state theory of the universe is not any closer to creation ex nihilo than the Big Bang. Okay? Creation ex nihilo means there is no scientific account of creation. And I'm not the first one to say that. The Ramban says that. The Ramban, who believes in creation ex nihilo, says that you can understand basic basis with any logic. Why not logic? Because they say with logic, the logic that pre-exists before the world, therefore that's eternal. So, creation ex nihilo means is that there is not a scientific account of the world. Just like the Rambam's creation means that the world was not created at any time.
So you can't say God created the world with rationality.
No, it does not.
If there is a point where the world begins, because you couldn't. You can't create rationality ex nihilo.
No. I think you're confusing. You cannot give a scientific account of the world because if you do, that means that there was laws of science based upon which the world is being created. So that means that before the world, there's science. Einstein exists before the world. Yeah, what do you want to say?
Why doesn't creation ex nihilo automatically imply an eternity? Because creation ex nihilo implies that at a specific time the world's created. So automatically
you're contradicting the Rambam. The Rambam says that if you believe creation, you can't believe the world was created at a certain time. That's what the Rambam saying. You contradict the Rambam. You want to say what you want to say, it's fine. The Rambam says explicitly, you cannot say the world was created at any time. That's what the Rambam says. That makes sense.
So creation ex nihilo doesn't
that's why
at a specific time?
Right, that's what we're speaking about. That's everything we're speaking about. Therefore, the Rambam says, look at chapter 13, the Rambam says, if you believe the world was created ex nihilo, you cannot say the world was created in one time. He repeats that several ways and formulations so no one should misunderstand that. Which means creation ex nihilo is not a account of the creation of the world, not in certain space-time, not in scientific terms. Not to mention that the way they popularly picture the Big Bang is totally scientifically inaccurate today. I mean, today, not only for years, the scientists believed it was time before the Big Bang. I referred to an article by Veneziano in Scientific American about 10 years ago. But in addition to that, too, today the newest theory, which is actually being accepted more by scientists, is a book called The Endless Universe by, I think, Steinberg and Princeton, one at Oxford, who believe that actually every 13 billion years, there's two universes which actually collapse zusammen, they get together every 12 billion years and they make a Big Bang. Okay? Now, the fact is that the Ramban says the world...
How long till the next one?
We don't know. But I don't know if we'll be around to speak about it.
Okay.
At least I don't know if Shkafasakal Dakar comment there or we ought to be around. But anyway. So in any case, in other words, whoever has staked his emunah, his faith, based upon that the Big Bang's creation proves the Chumash,
should visit a different website right now.
Right. Okay. In any case, okay. So in other words, but in my opinion there's no need for the esoteric and for the... In other words, the Rambam required both. Now, there is a notion of esotericism. Obviously, the Rambam doesn't say what I'm saying. We're reading it into the Rambam. I feel the Rambam says explicitly in several places, which I've shown. But the fact is once again, we understand what the Rambam was faced with. In other words, the Rambam was faced with, there was a popular conception that there was a contradiction between Aristotle and Jewish philosophy. So the Rambam was writing according to that popular conception. I mean, there's a popular conception that there are three theories of the world. The fact is, at the end, the alerted, enlightened reader of the Meir Triebitz discovers, at the end of chapter 30, that in fact, there isn't a debate between these conceptions of the world, because one is a scientific concept of creation, and one is a concept of free will. So the Rambam was, in my opinion, is writing just upon, because that was the debate. Creation ex nihilo versus the eternity of the world. That was the debate. But at the end of the entire journey, we realized that they weren't arguing on anything. They were just speaking about different aspects of different aspects.
I think Rambam could even live with the Aristotelian theory.
What?
Rambam could even live with the Aristotelian theory of cadmus.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And in fact, actually, there were many of the Forshim who said that was the position of the Rambam. But I'm not saying this, it wasn't the Rambam to right, and that's coming to exclude. And that's my position. So I think, scholars, whatever it is, other people do, but sometimes scholars tend to sort of like read the pashtus. In other words, the Rambam says something, well, chalk it down, and he said there's something different. But the fact is that I think that the Rambam's works were much more planned out than what it appears to. It isn't a type of oil. Okay, anyways, I think this ends the discussion of the fourth principle. Like I said before, much ink has been spilled on this, but I think that I really believe I've laid all the issues to rest tonight, and we can continue to believe. You can believe in the Big Bang too. Okay, fine. Now, in Mitzvah Hashem, next time we're going to begin with prophecy, Nevuah. We actually quoted tonight from chapter 32, section 2, which begins section of Nevuah, and the Rambam actually divides the Ikkarim into two principles. The sixth principle is Nevuah, prophets, and then there's Nevuah Moshe Rabbeinu. But as we'll see, Moshe Rabbeinu has absolutely nothing to do with Nevuah the other prophets. They're two different principles that have nothing to do with each other. But that we will speak about in Mitzvah next time from an undisclosed place, Yerushalayim HaKodesh. Have a good week. A good tavach.